happy to be able to announce our next couple of speakers. So we actually have two people coming up on stage, and it's utilising research-based advocacy to improve the visibility of women in sports media. What an excellent topic. So Philip Clark leads the communications team at Sport New Zealand and is the organisation's former media manager. He's responsible for the Sport New Zealand Isentia study of gender balance in sports news coverage, and to support this undertakes extensive stakeholder engagement with media, sports and others to help drive positive change. Philip has worked in sport for 10 years and was previously PR and media manager at New Zealand for ICC Cricket World Cup 2015. As Insights Director, Ngaire Crawford is the Regional Head for Research at Isentia across New Zealand and Australia. Ngaire is also the chair of the Next Gen Hub, a talent and ideas incubator for AMAC, which stands for the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. That's a pretty long title and an important award, I hear. She has more than 15 years in the field of communications and media research, with a particular focus on the role of representation, and is a passionate advocate for communications measurement and how the right evaluation is critical to ensuring success. Welcome, team.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Philip Clark from Sport New Zealand. I did like the little flag next to my picture, and Ngaire's too, just to reinforce that we are from across the ditch. This is Ngaire.
Hi, I'm Ngaire. I run one of the best kept secrets at Isentia, which is our Insights and Research team. And yeah, you've heard in our little intro that we do really wonderful work, including this great project with Sport New Zealand.
Just a warning that this presentation is full of photos of sport. I was speaking to someone out at one of the breaks who walked away from me when I said I was presenting about sport because they don't like sport. It is about sport, but it's kind of also not about sport. At a really fundamental level, what we're trying to do is change the behaviour of media. We're trying to change the way they think about who they hire and what they cover, and turn that into results that are more favourable for women's sport and female athletes. So, I mean, most people in this room would have at some point tried to get the media to do what they want. That's exactly what this is about, using really good research and using really good conversation. But like I said, there's lots of images about sport, and as someone who works in sport and likes sport, I like photos of sport, so I'm not going to apologise too much about that. A little bit about Sport New Zealand. The quickest way to explain this and save time is that we are like Sport Australia. We're more like Sport Australia now because they changed their name from what it was to Sport Australia, so it sounds like Sport New Zealand. We are an organisation of two halves. One of it is Sport New Zealand. We're like the parent company. We're about participation outcomes, whether that is sport or it's active rec or it's play with kids. As long as people are active, we don't really care. We have a wholly owned subsidiary called High Performance Sport New Zealand. It is about winning on the world stage. As you would imagine, they are culturally very, very different parts of the organisation, but that's who we are. Just a bit about what we'll do today. We'll tell you a bit about the study because, you know, we think it's quite important, so we'll tell you a bit about that. I'll kind of talk to you about the stakeholder engagement approach that we take. I mean, what makes this study different from most bits of research is that it's a serious amount of work that goes into the stakeholder engagement. It's not about publishing research and handing it out to people and letting it gather dust. It's about live conversations and about using those conversations to reshape the study and evolve it so there's more data and more conversations. So I'll explain the kind of framework that we use. Then we'll take you through the journey of the study so that we can just explain how that stakeholder engagement has played out as we move forward. And there'll be a few little takeouts, and hopefully they're things that are relevant to what you do if you don't work in sport. And then there's time for questions. Hopefully there's more than one or two. We've left a big gaping hole in this so that there's an obvious question. I'll let you kind of try and pick that one. But there will be time for questions. About the study first, I always put this up. I quite like this. A little quirky thing about sport. In snow sports, you have to have a reference point in imagery. You can't just show a skier in the sky. They hate it. They want it, something that anchors them to their performance. So fundamentally, it's about putting female athletes in the spotlight. There is a virtuous cycle that exists in women's sport where if you don't have visibility, you don't have engagement. Engagement brings in the money and the value follows. So to get commercial input into women's sport, you need broadcast audiences, we need people attending matches. So we're trying to interrupt that virtuous cycle with visibility. We're doing it through this study, we're doing it through an advertising campaign we'll launch in a few months. as well. So it's kind of a big focus for us. There are some specific objectives, which I'll talk about in a minute because I couldn't remember that this was coming. So, in fact, I should go back because I think no. We've got a special situation in New Zealand because we've got 3 Women's World Cups. So there was a lot of change happening in sports media and in terms of coverage of women's sport. We are really fortunate, I've said to a few Australians the last couple of days, because we have a minister, when he came into office in 2017, walked into our office and said, my number 1 priority for you is women's sport. And we had a strategy for that and investment for that within about 6 months. And one of the commitments we made is this study. So there's a lot of opportunity wrapped around hosting those 3 World Cups. One of them has already been played. Those of you who follow cricket will know Australia won it. I was at the final with my daughter wearing Australian shirts, by the way, that's incidental. So there's a massive kind of thing that they weren't in place when we started, but they are now another big reason why we're doing it. These are the objectives that we set when we did the study. None of them are about targets. So when we started out, the first thing was we had to benchmark where we sat with women's sport in terms of gender balance of coverage and in terms of bylines through reporting. We want to be in a position to celebrate change. We knew that there were some good things happening and we knew that more good things would happen. So being able to measure it means we can celebrate it. And then we want change to happen. It's not all happening through Sport New Zealand. Like we're putting data out there to sports and to influencers and others, but we ourselves are doing a lot to drive that change. So that's kind of what it's about. Scope, Ngaire.
So, sometimes a really big question has quite a simple initial research answer. So what we do in the study is a really large-scale piece of media analysis. At the moment, it is around 40,000 items of coverage that are all analysed by people every year. There's a really specific reason that we analyse it with people, mostly because what we're really looking at in this context is media construction and representation. So we are looking at framing, we're looking at image construction, language, all of those types of things. In this presentation, you'll see quite a bit about media space, which is incredibly important and drives a lot of the stakeholder engagement, but there is also this other element to it that requires a lot of human interpretation on media construction and editorial choices. So this covers online, print, TV and radio. It does not include match broadcasts or live blogging of matches. It's really focused on news media, and the level to which we go into community sports is pretty limited because we are focusing more on high audience and high impact conversations. So what this looks like. We release reports annually. So there are now 2 reports, one which was released a couple of weeks ago. These wrap up a whole year's worth of data so that we can start to track the changes, make year-on-year comparisons, and how we're actually managing to shift that dial, as Phil mentioned. The other element is to really help drive stakeholder engagement is to have regular research releases. One of the things that's really important to most people that you'll find that work in research is we never love measuring one thing once. So we want to be able to keep research live and in an active conversation. So one of the ways that we do that is really through regular case studies and deep dives so that there's always a constant conversation about this type of analysis.
And I should just point out at this point, just to thank Ngaire, that when we originally set up the study, the scope of it was to do the annual report and to do a mid-year dashboard, it's called, a much small report in the middle of the year, and to have a social media study. So I would always have conversations with people from NSOs, so we love acronyms, national sporting bodies, and they would complain about the media and coverage of women's sport, and I would acknowledge that was a challenge and say, well, what are you doing in your channels? So we wanted to measure the gender balance in the channels of our partners, the social channels. And we did an initial study, pulled some data out in the first year, and what we found was actually there was tremendous balance. They had already done it well, and so there was no point doing an ongoing study of that. So we recycled the investment out of that and out of the dashboards and introduced the case studies. So we've got scope to do 6 case studies or deep dives every year, which just helps maintain the visibility of the study. Gives us more data, there's more targeted conversations we can have. So I'm appreciative of Ngaire for giving me that flexibility to just rejig it a bit as we went.
So this next 2 slides is really just running through what some of the high-level findings were from our most recent release. And to touch a little bit more on some of that social media element, for those of you that are really interested in metrics in the room, we did a full qualitative audit of all of those owned channels to be able to double check how they were framing everything compared to that editorial analysis.
And that's about 80 brands, I think, were in that.
So,
round of applause, 21%, by the way. Thank you.
The fun contextual point is actually that year on year this is up from 15%. So when we first measured this, the gender balance of women's sport was 15%, it's now 21%. There are two different ways that we look at this. There is gender balance, which is looking at the amount of coverage that is about women's sport. And then we also track visibility, which is about what kind of people you see in sports coverage. So that is also trending upwards, so that has increased from 15% to 19% in the last year.
And so the lead metric by a long shot is balance, because that reflects the product that the media are creating and trying to sell. Visibility is another important thing, but it kind of lags behind that for me, certainly in terms of prioritisation. We are kind of seeing in the second year across a bunch of different metrics that visibility, if you look at that overall sources, the people who are quoted, the growth in that lags behind balance. So you're more likely to see coverage of women's sport than you are to see females in that coverage. So hopefully that changes over time.
And one of the questions we get quite quickly when we say that it has gone up by 6% is getting an idea of what the impact of Tokyo was, given that that is, the Olympics are a more gender balanced event, but this, when you take Tokyo out of our data set, it takes it down from 21 to 19, so there is an impact, but it means that we're still up significantly year on year. The Olympics and the Paralympics represent around 8% of all sports news coverage in 2021 and 20% of women's coverage.
So our Olympic team was 50-50 gender-wise, and roughly a little bit more female medals than male medals. The Paralympic team was almost all female. So that kind of boosts those numbers a bit. But most people are really surprised, media in particular, about how little of that growth came from Tokyo.
So you are going to see a few charts now, and I'm going to do my best to explain them, but only because I know they're a little bit hard to access in this type of environment. So this shows you the gender balance of each of the major sports, also the share of media voice that they have. So the kind of core takeout from this slide of a lot of data is that the top three sports account for 60% of all sports news coverage in New Zealand, but only 11% of women's sport. They're also the three World Cup sports. We also have a look at teams and events so that we can start to get an idea of where there's areas of potential. So again, because you can see that the male balance is grey, you can see that a lot of the teams and events are still very male dominated in terms of what gets covered. The other element that we track, which is very important, is around that kind of construction and authorship of news. And we track all of the bylines. So we're looking at who is writing and who is presenting and who is reporting about women. And we do distinguish between reporters and presenters, because there is a tendency in sports journalism particularly for women to be sports presenters more so than reporters, and particularly true in print and online newsrooms. And we do actually see a decline in this in the study year on year.
So we have a long-standing challenge in New Zealand, and the same is true here in Australia, in attracting females into sports journalism. It's really hard to attract them in. When they do come in, they're far more likely to want to work in television. We have two main TV networks. They have both got about 50%. Our newspapers would have 1 out of about 25. And it's because it's seen as an old boys club. And there's a natural hierarchy in sports journalism where the longer you've been in, the more established you are, the better the beats you get. So the top guys tend to cover rugby, and it's really hard to break through, and the females just don't want to be in there.
But the most important thing about that stat and that decline is that gender balance still went up. So I think that it's important to make the point that coverage of women does not always require a women author. So those two data points for us are not currently related.
Yeah, we're trying to solve two different problems at the same time, and a lot of people influencers in the space will say that you need one to get the other, and so it's helpful to prove that that's not the case.
So, how does New Zealand compare internationally? I think this is an important context to that 15% and that 21%. Quite well. The other element to this is that these studies aren't as common. They often exist in more academic spaces with smaller samples. So, and they tend to be analysed once rather than having this kind of ongoing benchmark or standard. So you can see there that typically the best kind of that we've seen is up to 10% in the UK, and that was driven by really specific events. But the global average is actually around 4% of sports news being about women.
And I've spent the last couple of days talking to media and sports in Australia, and one of the things that comes up a lot is I'll say to them, I'm really envious of Australia with sport for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of it's free to air, which is not New Zealand, so there isn't the same barrier to engagement. And also that Australia's far more advanced than New Zealand in terms of female leagues. So we don't have the equivalent of the Women's NRL or AFL. We've got an equivalent of the Big Bash, it's nowhere near as big. So that week in, week out coverage is what's going to really shift the dial. World Cups won't do it. So the thing that we've got that Australia doesn't got, we're a bit more progressive in this space, is the general perception among the Australians I've spoken to. And it helps that we've got the government strategy. So the government standing up and putting a stake in the ground around women in sport and putting investment behind it. Our investment partners, the sports, have followed suit. The media recognise that, so there is a kind of will in New Zealand to want to do better. And if you could mirror that in Australia, given the strengths that you've got, there'd be some amazing kind of results, I think. Next, just a bit of background on stakeholder engagement, and I'll kind of spin over this quite quickly. A lot of it's just kind of context about New Zealand, and one of the things that won't surprise you is that we're a really, really small country. So if this was done in Australia, it would be a big bit of research because the media landscape is so much bigger, and it would be a massive job in terms of stakeholder engagement because the media is far more complex. So we've got a little bit easy, which helps. At a highest level, this is what I look for. So my view is about the more conversations that I have, the more change we'll get. And I'm always looking for people who see opportunity in the numbers. Not everybody does. Not everybody does first time, but the more conversations, the more numbers, the more opportunities is the kind of the rule of thumb. These are the three kind of core stakeholder groups. The media, obviously. Sports, obviously. They're the ones who work with athletes and work with media. We're really lucky and we don't really have an events industry. Well, we do, but not a sports events industry. So with very few exceptions, our national sporting bodies deliver the events. Apart from, we have things like the Winter Games and the Warriors are a franchise and the Phoenix and the A-League are a franchise, but otherwise it's the sports. So you talk to the sports, you're talking about events at the same time. And I'll cover the influences off in a bit. The media first, look, it's a tiny, tiny place, right? So we've got 6 main media organisations. All the ones that are left are that white bit, it's 3%. So I can cover off 97% of the media landscape in New Zealand talking to 6 people. So it's kind of quite easy to have those conversations and cover those bases. The sports, it simplifies quickly. So we invest as Sport New Zealand in 65 sports. There are more sports than that. They have to meet certain criteria to get our investment, namely to be able to grow participation. But the 65, only 46 of them get any media coverage whatsoever. If I wanted to work through the people in NSOs that in sports who deal with the media, there's only 16 of them. Most of those 16 are a team of 1, stretched really thinly, so they don't have the bandwidth to be really highly engaged with media relations. It gets easier because 8 of them are 4/5 of all the sports coverage and 3 of them are 60% of the sports coverage. So the approach that we take with stakeholder engagement is a top-down one on that pyramid. So we work really heavily with the top 3 sports. We'll do special studies for the top 3 sports that give them a lot of granular data, a lot of opportunities that they can use to drive their media engagement programs. From 3 down to about 16, we'll do sessions a couple of years with the comms teams and the NSOs. That's quite a sticky audience, quite tricky. Like they are stretched a bit, so it's going to move from just having conversations to probably giving them some guidance. And beyond that, we are sharing the study with all of our partners, with all of the sports, and doing things like webinars once a year so that they can opt in. There's an invitation to put their hand up and have one-on-ones. Very few of them do because they're the ones without comms people. And to be honest, I'm about shifting the dial. I'd love to see balance go up in all sports, but I want to shift the dial. So it's those top three that's going to do the trick. And as you've said from Ngaire's bit before, they're our World Cup sports. The influencers, these are the kind of general groups that we work with. We do have, unlike in Australia where Women's Sport Australia has no federal government funding, Sport New Zealand invests in women's sport Aotearoa. So we have a body that is an advocate for women in sport. We have a body that is an advocate for women in sports broadcasting and sports journalism. So they're really key influencers. There are some particularly former athletes who are really vocal in the space. Our Olympic Committee did a leadership program a few years ago that focused specifically on visibility. There are some in the media that are particularly vocal about this, so they kind of get into this kind of group as well. And then some academics who have done previous research, and journalism students are kind of a go-forward target because they're the future for it. So I want to be able to demonstrate to them that the landscape is changing, encourage them to be part of that landscape, and have them kind of step up and push for more change. And then this is the kind of model that is used for stakeholder engagement. It's not rocket science, but the gist of it is that whenever we produce data, there's a conversation to be had. Most of the ways in which we evolve the study, and we evolve it a lot all the time to make it better, not bigger, but better, a lot of that comes from ideas from the stakeholders, or it's us responding to what we think will add value to them. And then as we evolve it, we get more data, and around it goes. And all of that just means more conversations. And as I said before, more conversations, more change. This is how we use this is really simplistic. It's not really literally like this if I had a timeline of the study. But the gist of it is that we wanted to create a regular flow of data coming out of the study for two reasons. One is to maintain visibility. The other is to provide regular opportunities for engagement. So between using the big reports and case studies and specific deep dives, we get that regularity. So there's probably deep engagement with media about 4 times a year. The case studies are quite niche, so it's not, it's always the same, but regular conversations, really open conversations. A lot of work went into creating a safe environment around the study, so they didn't see this as central government whacking them with a stick. And so that's created a lot of trust and a lot of interest. Most media are bringing in their senior bosses into the conversations now. So we're getting really good conversations, really good dialogue. Now we start to step through the steps in the project, and Ngaire will come back soon. I know you're on the edge of your seats. I'm doing a lot of the talking, and that's ironic for a talk about gender balance, right? But I will do this bit first. So in the design phase, the first thing that I did was create a reference group, and that reference group really was everyone on the influencer slide. So there are a whole bunch of people who had done studies like this, or who would have wanted to do the study if they had access to the government money. Academics, those interest groups. So they both of our Olympic and Paralympic committees, so we brought them together to help design what the research would be. We looked at what we could achieve through this research, what we could do through complementary research, worked on the problem definition so that they had a really important role in what the project looked like. There was also some important early engagement with media and with sports, particularly with the media. So they were made aware of it really early on, that it was coming, about 10 months before it was published. So they knew we were starting work on it. There was an invitation to have conversations about it. They knew they would be named in it. They knew what we were trying to achieve. They knew what it wasn't designed to beat them with a stick. And a bit the same with sports. So just getting people on the bus really, really early.
In terms of what it looked like for us, the 40,000 items a year obviously sounds like a lot, but even in New Zealand, that's not quite a lot. It's not the entire amount of data that's available. It is a representative sample. It's about 30%. And one of the elements that's always tricky in research like this is that it is highly representative, but what we are seeing with that stakeholder engagement is that they want more granular information. So we're trying to find and constantly evolve how we look at the data set so that we're able to balance granularity with, feasibility of something that is this big, and it is that level of flexibility that allows us to future-proof the study.
Yes, it is. And I love this about this study. There are about 100 markers that are tracked. And the trick with this is that future-proofing, right? So if you lock in those markers at the start and they're coded from day one, you can just go back in later on. So if I'm having a conversation with the media and there's something they would like to see that we haven't reported, we can just go back into the data set and pull it out. We also future-proofed it outside of gender. So it includes disability, it includes sexual orientation where that's self-identified. We'd love to look at ethnicity. You can't do that. The only way to do ethnicity would be to go to the athletes. We would have to go to sports and look for either where they could easily confirm or where an athlete would offer to confirm it. But there's other aspects of D&I that we can look at through the study. It doesn't have to just be about gender. Reports. So there are big reports. It's a bit like an annual report. In fact, we now call it the annual report. And it's kind of seen like that. So when we release the annual report, that has the kind of higher status. The media bosses pay more attention to it. The sports pay more attention to it. The minister pays more attention to it. So it is that one time a year where the new number comes out. And we know whether we're up. We know whether we're down. The media know that, how they stack against their peers. So that we do the most engagement with the annual report. And we're doing it across all stakeholders, where the case studies might just be the sport that covers it. It might just be the journalists within the media who cover that sport. So that's the kind of big one. This conversation's mainly about stakeholder engagement. There is some kind of comms that goes with it. Generally speaking, it's the whole thing with media. They generally don't like to cover themselves, but there are some media who do like to cover themselves, and there are some media that come out looking really good, and they definitely want to cover themselves. So we do some targeted media, more and more, quite a bit with the last report. We don't push social too hard. We really only spruik this on LinkedIn. New Zealanders don't do Twitter. So Sport New Zealand, I've been trying to get us to can our Twitter channel for about 6 years. I think I'm about that close to getting across the line. No one engages with it. Most of our followers are from, Australia and England. People who toured in 2017 to watch the Lions. But we do, so a bit of PR, a bit of social. We'll do webinars for our partners and others, and we'll do a bit of stuff like this. But really, by the time we publish the report, the 100 people that need to know already know through the stakeholder engagement. Yes, it's you, sorry.
I think it's more that we're running pretty short on time, but this is just an example of the type of data that the media companies get. So they love a competitive chart, so being able to see how they track. They love a benchmark, being able to see where they are in comparison to it. So this is just an example of that. Yeah, this is a real hook for them. It's that competitive tension. Same with being able to start splitting out the different types for media companies that have don't cover all types, but have a difference between their broadcast and their online, just being able to start showing them that information as well. Same with bylines and presenters. Yeah, and that bylines, like I said, is really low. So in most cases, that's a single person. I could tell you their name afterwards if you'd like to know. Sports. So same thing here, where you can engage with the sports themselves around how they're tracking year on year, also how their share of media coverage is tracking year on year, to be able to create that level of benchmarking and balance and competitiveness that is quite appropriate for sport. Yeah, and so with the sports, they obviously want to see whether they're going up or down. We can see where the growth is. It's really good this year that rugby and cricket and football are all up. So those three big sports that are 60% are all heading in the right direction. Netball's down. That's the challenge really around event delivery with COVID. And in this one, look, we don't publish this stuff in the report. I included, this is a good example of what we use with stakeholder engagement. So this is the top 5 women's sports for each of the 6 main media outlets. And so if you work in the media or if you work in a sport, there's loads of hooks in this. I won't draw them all out for you, but the big one, middle centre, is that TVNZ, most media outlets are doing more netball coverage than they were a year before, or a little bit less. TVNZ's doing about half of what it was. So if you're Netball New Zealand, that is a conversation to have with TVNZ. And so it's an example of how the data throws up little opportunities to have conversations about what's going on and how to change it. And that's kind of the power of the research for us.
just a little bit about the case study. As I said, it's about creating regular opportunities and getting more focus with the engagement, looking into specific aspects of sports coverage.
So with one of the biggest success stories we've had with the case studies is the change we've seen in coverage of the Super Smash tournament for cricket. When we started tracking this, 80% of that coverage was very short, didn't have any quotes, didn't have any depth. And then we've seen continuous improvement since then. So we would also see that for Stuff, which is the largest outlet in New Zealand, previously Fairfax, they underrepresented women but were overrepresenting in share of voice.
And so from an engagement perspective with those two facts, so we knew that 4 out of every 5 stories was a really just like a column brief with no quotes. And so the conversation with media is, if you're going to do a match report, stick both matches in it. They're double headers, for Christ's sake. The point with this one, this was a great thing to find out because Stuff is the biggest media company in New Zealand. Its market share was about 38%. So it's punching above its weight in terms of coverage of this competition, but it's way down the pecking order in terms of gender balance. So if we could, like the easy way to shift the dial with the Super Smash was to get them to do it better. They've got the best regional footprint, so they've got people closer to the venues. So actually it became a really targeted one-to-one conversation about Super Smash to a large extent. And then this happened.
So what we saw with the most recent tournament is after this prolonged period of measurement and stakeholder engagement is that balance is now up to 49% for that tournament.
And what Stuff is doing now is doing exactly what we wanted them to do, which is doing a lot of small match reports that cover both matches. They're also doing longer form match reports for one of the 2 events in the doubleheader, and about 60% of those are about the women's game, not the men's game. So actually their response has been really outstanding. And then this stuff we chapped in, this is a good example of how stretching beyond gender. So we did a case study of the Olympics and the Paralympics, which wasn't gender at all for us because we knew what it would say about gender because the Paralympic team was about 75% female and the Olympic team was 50% female. And surprise, surprise, that's what their gender balance figures were. So I wanted to explore the different returns you would get as an Olympian versus a Paralympian, because that's a great conversation to have with media about those 2 events, and it's great leverage for Paralympics New Zealand, who are massively less resourced than our New Zealand Olympic Committee is. So what this looks at is how the extent to which they dominated sports coverage in their event window. So grey is the event, white is everything else. So the Olympics swamps sports coverage during its window. The Paralympics barely makes a dent. The team was a lot smaller is the first thing. So it's 27 versus about 220. But there's only so much coverage the media can take anyway. So you'd always expect the Olympics to be bigger, but not that much bigger. And then this is what happens when you look at athletes. So this is something we were really excited about doing. Just for your background, Tupanauefi, the yellow ones, Tupanauefi is a swimmer. She raced in 2 events. She won a gold medal. Anna Grimaldi is long jump. Her event is straight to final. She was the defending Paralympic champion. Emma Twigg was in her 4th Olympics. She'd made finals but never reached the podium. She won gold. Val Adams at the bottom, legend in New Zealand, won bronze, had medalled a lot before. They got a lot more coverage than the Paralympians did. And that is a great finding if you are an advocate for Paralympic sport, because it's hard for the media to respond to that. And for Paralympics New Zealand to have that data to take into their planning for Paris is an amazing thing to have. So, and then out of those case studies, we've now got some examples of what I call the mega event effect. So those numbers aren't about gender balance in those events. That is the extent to which that event shifts the overall dial with gender balance in all sports coverage during that window. So in the Olympics, 42% of all sports coverage is about female athletes. The Cricket World Cup one was significant because it was the first of those 3 World Cups. So it gives a benchmark for those 3. I walked around saying it'd get to 50%. It didn't. Shane Warne's passing had a big impact. That kind of dominated our sports coverage for about 3 days, as I'm sure it did here at the start of the tournament. But what we also saw was that you weren't getting 4 or 5 stories in one outlet about the tournament. You weren't getting the match report plus the look at the game the next day. You were getting one story. So, and that's, again, for the other two local organising committees, it's good insights to have in terms of their media engagement around their World Cups. This is just a quick look at, like I said, we're changing it all the time. So we made about 7 changes for year 2. These are the planned changes for year 3. I won't go through all of them, other than probably 2. Story type is what it suggests. You've got little match reports at one end of the spectrum, you've got features at the other. So we want to understand the balance of those in terms of overall sports coverage and how gender balance looks within each of them. My favourite is the athlete survey. I think this is an example of portrayal. The reason I bring this up is that this is really subjective, right? You could all have views about whether it's good to have your personal life covered in sports coverage versus being about your results. I could have an opinion about that, neither of us would be right probably. So what we want to do is actually survey athletes and get their views on some of the key markers in portrayal. It would allow a whole lot more value to this data and a whole lot more value to the stakeholder engagement. We can also ask athletes how important sports media coverage is to them. One of the things that's come up in conversations this week is that some of the top female athletes in Australia, they want to be criticised by the media if they perform badly. There is a reluctance among sports media to criticise female athletes. So actually surveying female athletes about that could be fascinating. We might skip the takeouts because we're out of time. I'll do them really quickly in 2 minutes, shall I? I've said those, I won't do it. The first thing is just with any research, right? Don't just publish it and don't just engage. Engage meaningfully. Like, the conversations that we are having are really deep, regular conversations. They're really serious conversations. It's not window dressing in any kind of fashion. Maintaining visibility is crucial for this study, I think for any study. And with that goes regular dialogue. But that's a really key takeout, I think. And this thing it's two-way, right? We are sharing the data, but we're also listening and learning. And as I said, what we're being told is helping reshape the study. And then we're responding to stakeholder needs. So we're doing research about them, so it makes sense that we understand what might help them more and use that to reshape the study. Then it's more useful to them, they're more likely to engage in it. And then last, just persist with the tricky people, right? Like, and for me, the tricky people are the sports, that they're really interested in it, but they don't have a willingness to do anything with it. So my approach is to start with those big 3, work really closely, and then move down. But I'm not going to leave them and forget about them because Sport New Zealand can't do all of this by ourselves. We need the sports to deal with their own sports media and to change the way that they operate with media management, putting females forward instead of putting men forward, being more proactive in showcasing their female athletes and teams. So just persistence is critical, right?
When is this coming to Australia?
Working on it.
Okay.
Working so hard on getting that because I think it's so important, and we found it's so valuable to drive so many conversations that drive change.
Yeah, well, you can tell from the numbers that Philip was alluding to and the change that's been made in the New Zealand mainstream media. I mean, certainly you could use it here as well. So thank you both.